you ever walked into a grocery store, looked at the empty shelves where the eggs should be, and thought, what is going on? Or maybe your grocery store has recently restocked the eggs and your eyes are bugging out at the price tag for a dozen eggs that you're sure was much less a month ago. I'm pretty sure you've heard about avian flu sweeping through poultry farms, and you're wondering, how serious is this? What does it mean for our food supply? You're listening to One Bite is Everything, the podcast that connects every bite you take to the bigger world, sparking curiosity and inspiring you to ask more questions about the food on your plate. From your plate to the world, I am your host, Dana DePrima, and today I am your guide through the complicated, ever-changing world of food, food systems, agriculture, and even biosecurity. Today we're diving into a critical question: how do we balance the need for food security, farm sustainability, and biosecurity in the face of rapidly evolving diseases like avian flu? To help us untangle this, we are joined by Michael Rhys, CEO and co-founder of Barnwell Bio. His company is on the front lines of monitoring and mitigating disease risks in livestock using innovative biosecurity measures. In this episode, you'll learn why avian flu outbreaks aren't just a poultry problem, but a broader food security issue, how cutting-edge monitoring technology is changing the way farmers detect and prevent disease, the role of government policy, vaccinations, and farm-level decisions in shaping the future of agriculture, and we'll explore one of the biggest unanswered questions: what happens when this crisis passes? Will we actually learn from it, or will we just move on to the next one? So, if you're ready to understand what's actually going on with your food supply and what can be done to protect it, stick around for this episode of One Bite is Everything. In the past few years, avian influenza, or bird flu, has been a significant issue for the agricultural industry in the United States. The H5N1 strain, which was first detected in wild birds and poultry in early 2022, has caused widespread devastation. Millions of birds have been culled to prevent the virus from spreading, and farms across the country have been hit hard. This outbreak has raised concerns not just about food security, but also about the potential for the virus to infect humans. While human cases are rare, they have been reported mostly among farm workers who have had direct contact with infected animals. The USDA has been working tirelessly on containment strategies, but as of 2025, the virus is still making its presence known, affecting both poultry and even mammals, including dairy cattle in certain states.
Farms can be doing everything they should be doing, and then before they know it, avian flu pops up on the farm. And we had one farm who said when it happened on a neighboring farm, that it was Operation Doomsday for them. And so I think the operators that we work with really are kind of in this state of anxiety, and the fear is pretty palpable. And so I think the other piece of it is, it's not going to get better anytime soon. It's not as if things have slowed down kind of on the culling side. It's not as if the rate of infections have really stopped. And so I expect to see this continue for a bit. I will say things that we're really looking at closely are some of the regulatory changes that could be coming. So specifically, and this is largely on the poultry side, specifically vaccinations, I think will be really interesting to see how that plays out. And also not doing the mass cullings that you see when a farm gets infected. I think both of those are really interesting. I think there are a lot of considerations to think about with both of them. Our view at Barnwell is, in both scenarios, you would want to increase the amount of surveillance and biosecurity you're doing to understand where the disease is. Is it going up? Is it going down? What variants are on the farm? But it's been really challenging, obviously, for the farms. For us as a business trying to navigate the space, things are changing very quickly.
Can you talk a little bit about those two regulatory branches there, the vaccination part and the reduction in culling?
Yeah, so they're related to each other. There's been a hesitancy to do the vaccinations. There are some sort of import-export rules that prevent potentially exporting meat that's been vaccinated to certain markets. I think they might just do away with that and start doing the vaccinations. There are a few candidate vaccines in the pipeline. It's very similar to a flu vaccine in a lot of ways. I think what's good about it is you're going to hopefully reduce the amount of avian influenza. It's not a perfect vaccine, right? So you're going to get birds who still get sick. There are going to be lots of asymptomatic cases. But I think it could be a good starting point on the depopulation side that could be helpful in just trying to mitigate the losses that you're seeing, especially on the layer side of things. And I think, to be honest with you, I think a lot of the details of both of these are still being worked out in real time. And so we'll see what happens. I do think something needs to change because the current state is really not sustainable, right? I mean, you're seeing this on a grocery shelf in a way that I don't think we've seen something like this in a long time, where sometimes you go to the store and you just don't see eggs. And so something's got to give.
Vaccinating poultry against avian influenza can help reduce the spread of the virus within bird populations, which in turn lowers the chances of human exposure. When poultry are vaccinated, they are less likely to become infected, and if they do, they are less likely to shed large amounts of the virus into their environments. This means fewer opportunities for the virus to spread to other birds or to humans, especially those who work with or handle poultry, such as farm workers, processors, and other industry personnel. However, it's important to note that while vaccinating poultry can be a valuable tool in controlling avian flu outbreaks, it doesn't entirely eliminate the risk to humans. The vaccine is designed to protect birds and can reduce the severity of the disease, but it doesn't fully prevent the virus from mutating or changing. This is why health authorities continue to closely monitor any outbreaks and ensure that humans take the necessary precautions when handling poultry, especially in areas where vaccination programs are in place. Just a side note here. In 2025, the U.S. poultry industry is estimated to have approximately 1.5 billion chickens at any given time, including both broiler and egg-laying hens. Can you imagine the process for vaccinating all of those birds? It's not like you put some vitamins in their water. Each bird would need to be vaccinated individually. Before we dive any deeper into vaccinating poultry, in the short time between recording this episode and its release, Secretary Brooke Rollins of the U.S. Department of Agriculture rescinded her previous inclusion of a bird vaccine as a part of her 5-point strategy. According to Rollins, after speaking with industry leaders, she decided to focus more on repopulation over vaccination as a way forward. We'll keep an eye on this and see if it sticks or if it resurfaces. So let's jump into what Barnwell Bio is, and specifically, when you take on a farm, what are you doing?
Maybe I can share a little bit of background on myself and my co-founders. That kind of leads into what we're doing. My two co-founders are Casey and Jake. We come from the company that started and scaled our nation's COVID-19 wastewater monitoring infrastructure. And so during COVID, we were working with cities and mayor's offices to understand how COVID was spreading and changing in different geographies by monitoring municipal wastewater. And this was really powerful because it was a cost-effective way to get insights on an entire catchment of people, which was especially helpful early in the pandemic when there wasn't much clinical testing. And then, as testing happened at home, or people just sort of, stopped testing altogether, it still gave public health departments a window into what was going on. We worked on COVID. We also had products in flu, in RSV. And, waste and wastewater is a really powerful way to understand health and wellness. And so at Barnwell Bio, we're taking a similar approach to agriculture and to livestock specifically. And there are lots of benefits to our approach. And so, we leverage different waste streams. It looks really different depending on the farm that you're on. Right? A poultry farm is going to be different than a dairy, and I can talk about some of the specifics there. But basically, our approach is we collect a sample that's going to represent an entire farm or an entire barn, and then we analyze it for different pathogens. And our goal is to help farm operators that get a really clear understanding of what potential disease risk there is and give them the tools to be able to act more quickly. Sometimes there's a lot of guesswork that goes on in terms of animal health, and it can take a really long time to understand what the source of a disease outbreak is. And so what we're trying to build is a tool that can help folks get the answers more quickly. And so they're saving money, they're saving time, and hopefully we're giving them peace of mind around helping them prevent and mitigate things that might pop up on the farm.
So currently, how are farms testing?
There are lots of ways that they're doing disease surveillance. I mean, a big one is they do a survey every day where they look at the animals and see if animals are looking sick. I would say operators have a pretty good sense when animals are sick, right? They're moving a little bit differently. Maybe they're not eating as much or drinking as much. There are some other technologies on bigger livestock. You'll see potentially like a temperature monitor. So it'll kind of make a ping if there's a fever happening. Sometimes we see sort of these computer vision systems, right, where they're surveilling a bunch of poultry. And if they notice deviations or dead animals, right, they can pick that out. There is some, I think, more sophisticated farms will do kind of random diagnostic sampling, but they'll be looking for specific things and kind of a random selection of animals. And I think all of these are really helpful. I think the issue, especially with the first set, is a lot of those solutions are very symptom driven, right? And so if a cow has a fever, right? If a chicken isn't moving well, a lot of things can cause that, right? And understanding what that causal pathogen is, I think, is a really important thing to then think about, okay, well, what do I do about it, right? And sometimes what happens is, these things will say, hey, there's a problem. They'll try something just to try to get ahead of it. They'll try some additive or they'll try a treatment and maybe it works and, problem solved, but sometimes it doesn't, right? So then you have to go back and try to figure out what it is. And in that process, right, more animals are getting sick. They might be wasting money on treatments. And so what we're doing and what we're trying to say is let's use the waste and manure as our base source to understand, like, are we seeing any signal that might actually tell you what's that causal pathogen so you can act a little bit more quickly.
And in terms of prevention, which you mentioned, how is what you're doing helping a farm prevent something like that?
Yeah. So sometimes we think about doing like barn level scans to just assess, like, are there any things that are like in the litter of a chicken coop, right? Like some things just kind of like linger for a long time, even as you're cycling birds through. And so to prevent things, sometimes, we'll recommend, hey, like, let's do a scan before you place the birds. And maybe it is time to change the litter, right? Because things have been kind of lingering in there. And so you prevent the birds from getting it in the first place. I think longer term, our goal is potentially to be able to provide insights to farms based on what we're seeing kind of at a regional level, right? If we have enough information to say, hey, in your region, we're seeing a lot of Enterococcus, right? We're seeing a lot of this strain of E. coli. And so farms can start to maybe beef up their biosecurity ahead of something coming onto the farm. And that can look like a lot of things, right? Increasing airflow, doing some preventative additives. You can take the animals indoors a little bit more than you put them outside. Like, there are lots of little things that they might be able to do to prevent something from coming onto the farm in the first place. And we're hoping to, really enable that as well, in addition to the mitigation steps that they would be able to take.
So are you working mainly with industrialized farms?
Mostly with larger poultry farms. It's a combination though. I mean, some organic brands, some sort of like outdoor brands, but they are larger typically.
Let's talk about cross species. So we've got our meat birds and our layers, right? And then there is also some significant, I guess, outbreaks with dairy cows. Is that because of the litter going from chicken coops like those to the dairy farms to be repurposed?
There have been a lot of different theories. A big driver of avian flu in general is actually migratory birds. And so you're seeing some of the impacts of changing temperature on those flight paths. And that's actually impacted a lot of the cases of avian flu. I read recently it was something like 80+% of the cases have been driven by actually wild birds who are carrying the disease, who are flying in different areas, spreading it. Sometimes you see spread from like cats on farms, right, to impact the animals. So I don't think there's like a single answer for how it's been spreading.
Migratory birds definitely play a role in the spread of avian flu, but there's no clear statistic on exactly how much they infect poultry. Wild waterfowl can carry the virus without showing any symptoms, and their migration patterns help spread the virus across different areas. However, the exact rate at which they directly infect domestic poultry isn't well defined. There are a lot of other factors at play here, like how poultry farms are managed and the biosecurity measures in place. And these influence how the virus spreads. So while migratory birds contribute to the spread, they are not the only factor in how the avian flu affects poultry. Just to say, I have a big industrialized chicken farm and we have an outbreak and there are wild birds there and they're on the facility and then they catch it and they fly elsewhere and it spreads that way. That's what you're saying. They're not the originator of this.
They might be the originator, yeah. Because the birds who are in the facility are, pretty confined and they're not really exposed to a lot of different things typically. So the wild birds are sort of the vector for how it's spreading. There are different strains of avian flu, right? And so they carry one strain, and when it gets into other animals, it might mutate into a different strain.
Can I ask a gruesome question?
Sure.
Like in my chicken barn with 350,000 birds, I have some sort of outbreak or something is testing positive for avian flu, and it may be one bird, it may be a handful. They may have symptoms, they may not have symptoms, but we cull all of those birds with a foam or, some sort of gruesome death. What happens to those carcasses?
It's a good question. I believe they're sort of either incinerated or just fully disposed of to make sure that it's not spreading beyond that. Mm-hmm. And then there's a period of downtime on the farm that, they have to do some cleaning and kind of just sort of let it play out for a few months. So it's really disruptive, obviously, when these things happen.
Yeah, financially and otherwise, operationally, for sure.
Oh, yeah. And then sometimes, if you didn't clean enough or whatever, like it could come back. And so I think it's really hard to manage once it's on the farm.
The avian flu has hit the U.S. poultry industry hard, with over 160 million birds being euthanized since 2022. This has caused major production losses and pushed egg prices through the roof, with a dozen eggs costing as much as $4.95 in January of 2025, double what it was the year before. To help address this, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has rolled out a $1 billion plan to boost biosecurity, support affected producers, and explore vaccination options for poultry. Even with these efforts, experts say it could take a year or more for prices to settle and for the poultry industry to get back to normal. It's been a tough hit for the industry, and the ripple effects are still being felt. So is that something that you would help with as sort of the protocol for sanitizing a farm?
We haven't yet. That's absolutely something that through this grant, we've been thinking about is, maybe we can help reduce that downtime, right? If we can kind of do a scan and say, hey, we've done a few looks here and things look good. That would be, I think, a really interesting use case for us, but we haven't done that yet.
And I know we've mentioned a little bit of like panic and anxiety. Can you talk a little bit to the risk to humans?
Yeah. I'm not a public health expert. It seems the symptoms are very similar to kind of a seasonal flu. I mean, avian flu is a strain of influenza A. And so farm workers who are working closely with animals. You have seen some transmission there. Obviously, there's risk. I think the big risk is, what happens if this virus mutates, right? I mean, right now it seems to be similar to the kind of seasonal flu, but seasonal flu is dangerous. But also then you can imagine what happens if it mutates into something even more dangerous than it already is. So it's interesting to think about the different stakeholders. You have the farms who are managing kind of the animals, but then they're also responsible for obviously the workers on the farm and how you think about mitigating each of them. I mean, it's really hard, right, to think about how you think about it on the animal side, but then also for your laborers. I do think it's something that public health officials are monitoring really closely, especially the potential for it to mutate into something a lot more dangerous.
Let's go to eggs for a second, because I know we're having a nationwide panic over eggs and egg prices, right? Potential solutions to a shortage on the supermarket shelves from egg producers within the United States is to bring in imports of eggs from other countries, which I know is a controversial tactic. What is the thought from a biosecurity standpoint on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is probably more of a food safety question than an on-farm biosecurity, which is what we're focused on. I imagine that the eggs probably have to go through similar screenings for things like salmonella, right, is one that you would want to be looking at, that kind of the eggs that we're producing here would have to go through. It is really interesting on the import-export there's a lot going on, right? And like there are tariffs now involved, and is that going to impact what's happening with this? And so, I think it seems like it might be a helpful solution in the near term, but I think the focus, hopefully, on the sort of regulatory and government side is really continuing to build the resilience here, because it's bird flu is just one disease, right? Like we're so potentially vulnerable to so many other things. And so what I hope is happening is that we can take a moment to think about biosecurity much more broadly than bird flu and think about what are some solutions we can put into place here that will help us weather this storm, but then also the storm that's going to come in the next few years, right? And in addition to the day-to-day animal health challenges that farmers are going through. So probably isn't a super direct answer on your import question, because I think it's just hard, and again, this goes back to what I was saying, it's hard for us to navigate the daily kind of changes to it. And so I think once we start to see potentially more of it, then I think we can consider a little bit more of the biosecurity side of it.
In 2024, the United States imported approximately 71 million eggs from Turkey to alleviate domestic shortages caused by avian flu. According to the Food and Drug Administration, imported eggs go through a strict process to ensure they meet U.S. standards. First, the exporting country must be certified by the USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, the APHIS, confirming they follow biosecurity measures to prevent diseases like avian flu. Upon arrival in the U.S., eggs are inspected for contaminants, proper packaging, and overall compliance with U.S. food safety regulations, including checks for freshness and quality. Eggs are also fully traceable with documentation detailing their origin and handling. Additionally, veterinary health checks are conducted in the exporting country to ensure the eggs are free from disease. Even after reaching the U.S. market, random inspections by the Food and Drug Administration continue to ensure safety and quality. With the daily changing everything that's happening, we're pulling back a lot of regulations across the board, but also in relating to this egg panic, we've earmarked $1 billion in the USDA for trying to deal with this. Are you familiar with the details of that, and are you eligible for any of that funding?
I think there are more details that they need to provide on it. So I'm broadly familiar with the different categories of spend. There is about $100 million earmarked for vaccine development, kind of innovation. And so that's something we've been really hoping to engage with them on. And we have a few contacts there that we've been in touch with. I think there is potential to bring more innovation, and hopefully that's the goal of that 100 million. But what I will say is I think they still need to really drill down on what some of these different categories actually mean and how they'll actually allocate the money and what the process for allocating that money is. But we saw that and we were encouraged.
What are some of the other categories?
Some of the other categories are around biosecurity audits, basically, where they can bring someone onto the farm to help a farm kind of bolster their biosecurity and make sure they have the resources they need to put some additional things into place there. Some of the other categories are around obviously assisting enumeration for lost animals. I think those are the major buckets. And then, the kind of innovation is a little bit smaller.
And on the vaccine side, your interest in that is you wouldn't be helping to develop a vaccine, but you would be interested in that as a strategy.
I think it's a good strategy in general. I think what's interesting for us is we can look at different strains of H5N1 with the test that we're doing. And so that's helpful in one, identifying potentially where it came from. So I mentioned earlier, right? Wild birds are a vector. So there's a specific strain associated with them. There are strains associated with sort of animal to animal transmission. And so what that can actually tell a farm is, okay, where did this come from? And if I know where it came from, maybe I need to do something differently. Maybe I need more roofing, right? If it's a wild bird, or like maybe I need to think about how I'm grouping my animals within the barn, right? If it's coming from animal to animal. So that's one thing that we're interested in there. But as it relates to vaccines, it's really important. The vaccines are typically targeting certain strains. And if the virus mutates, it could potentially escape the vaccine and we would be kind of where we are now. And so really understanding how the virus is changing is something that we're very well positioned to do, especially because we're doing it in sort of a population level way. This was work we did at the COVID company, right? And it was really helpful as, folks in the industry were creating treatments to understand, okay, this is the actual strain I need to be looking at as I do my product development. And so that's where I think we can help support on the vaccine side.
And geographically, like your clients, where are you?
It's sort of all over. We have farm in Georgia, farm in Ohio, farm in Colorado. So we haven't really started to geographically focus anywhere yet.
What's your strategy going forward?
Yeah, I think there are a couple really important areas we want to expand into. I mean, one, we're really focused on disease right now. There's a lot of urgency around it, but the way that we're processing our samples and the way that we're analyzing this information, we can get information on nutrition biomarkers, animal wellness indicators like stress. We can measure cortisol in waste streams. We can measure, potentially greenhouse gases. And so our view is that from one sample, you can get lots of different information on animal health all in one place. And I think that doesn't really exist anywhere else. And so I think that's something that we're very excited about potentially being able to offer. I think the other thing is we've been focused on poultry, but there are animal health challenges across the board, as we see with dairy, cows, swine. There are a lot of different challenges there. And so I think in 5 years, we want to be able to work across all the different species of livestock, and then also really provide insights across the board on what can be going on. And our goal is to make farms more profitable, more efficient with the resources that they have, help them get ahead of disease challenges and really just optimize their most important asset, right? Running these big farms is making sure that these animals are healthy, right? And so if we can help support that, that's success in our book.
I wonder how sort of your work could then also be communicated to the consumer. I interviewed Joel Salatin, who at the time being considered as an advisor to the USDA, he was talking about that the regulation at the USDA level wasn't really necessary and that there was really other places for consumers to turn for, green check marks. And I just wonder if you guys have considered that kind of angle.
We would love to be able to reward farms who are treating animals well, doing sustainable practices, really putting in the effort, if we can provide an objective measurement of what that looks like and communicate that to the consumer, I mean, hopefully that farm gets rewarded by getting more money for their product. And hopefully the consumer is able to make an informed choice on what they're buying. And so absolutely, I think, that sort of space of the different labels and check, it's very confusing, right? And I think, there's a lot of confusing signals and just not a lot of clarity on the consumer side of which ones of these should I be paying attention to. Some of these are a lot higher quality than others in terms of their standards. And so I think especially on some of the animal wellness metrics that we're thinking about, it's pretty hard to measure that objectively. And so if we're able to provide more information there, that could be really great. And again, if we can support farmers in rewarding them for the work that they're doing to ensure that the animals live better lives, and that's great.
What have I not asked you that we need to cover?
You've asked a lot of very good questions. Maybe I can just flip it back to you. I mentioned we're focused on larger farms. What are some of the challenges that you've been seeing, whether it's on your farm or kind of some of the smaller farms as it pertains to disease, as it pertains to data input?
Well, I think that the anxiety level is high. I think that the question marks are also high, and the costs probably of having a very secure strategy for testing and, like my birds look fine. Everybody seems great, but they are until they're not. And I think a lot of small farms, especially, well, let's just say, especially in the poultry space, have birds that are outside, foraging in the wild. And like you said, they tend to be healthier because they're up against things and maybe they don't feel well today and then they recover or whatever from whatever it is. So I think that there's a level of anxiety. I think there's a concern about the expense of testing, about any kind of uncertainty. But I also think that they're seeing opportunities with consumers, particularly in marketing their products. Like you thought our eggs were expensive before, now you can't get eggs. And I think there's always that opportunity where people are scrambling, looking for eggs. Even my neighbors are like, do you have eggs? I'm like, I have so many eggs. Like, please come take them. But I think that there is that opportunity, but also a little bit of caution in terms of their optimism, because they've seen this during the pandemic where the entire world turned on a dime and wanted a CSA share and wanted to know a farmer and wanted to be close to that farmer and wanted to shop on the farm and wanted all of that good, healthy food that's raised at really at an elite level in terms of humane treatment and inputs and being outdoors and all of that. And then as soon as the panic dissipates, people are back to the supermarket shopping with industrial farms again. So I think that there's that, yay, but we're cautiously optimistic and always trying to keep our customers closer. And I think that they're also trying to, allay fears without glossing over them. I'm speaking out of turn here, but I think a lot of the smaller farmers would love, some easier ways of saying, hey, listen, my farm is healthy. We tested.
Yeah, that's very consistent with what we've been hearing. And we really are thinking about, this is such a moment for really thinking about biosecurity. Bird flu is in the news all the time. When this passes, which it will, how do we continue to think about biosecurity in a more long-term way, in a way that is less in the news, is less kind of serious in terms of the potential implications of killing all your animals, but are there ways that we can introduce more biosecurity in general to, again, make our food system more resilient kind of in the longer term? And I think COVID did some of that on the human side. And I hope that there's a similar moment of reflection as well.
Yeah, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, for sure. And
That's
right
exactly
now, the cure is pretty brutal on the poultry side, or, culling animals. Nobody wants to do that, and no one wants to hear about it. I am very interested in the idea that, yes, when this has passed and we get through this, that the opportunity for testing also to reflect, I think cortisol levels are interesting. I think if you are an industrial farmer and you're causing more stress to your animals than you realize, that is a good piece of data to have. And what can you do to fix it? Because I know farmers from small to industrial do have good intentions. I believe that for the most part, that's the truth. But it's harder to achieve on an industrial farm. And how are you managing that? And, whether it's a biohazard or other factors from the data, it's an interesting proposition.
I totally agree. I mean, I think the intentions are there. I mean, farms are also, it's probably one of the most important jobs in the world, right? And there's so much pressure from so many angles on farms, big or small, right? And I think just trying to help farms navigate all those different constraints is, if we can help do that, we've been successful.
So, what does the future of food security look like? If there's one thing we've learned today, it's that the way we monitor and manage disease in livestock isn't just about protecting farms. It's about protecting our entire food system. Michael Rhys and his team at Barnwell Bio are showing us that biosecurity doesn't have to be reactive. By using innovative monitoring technology, they're helping farmers catch disease earlier, reduce unnecessary losses, and ultimately create a more resilient agricultural system. But as we've discussed, the real challenge isn't just dealing with today's crisis. It's making sure we don't forget these lessons when the headlines fade. Will we invest in long-term solutions or just scramble again when the next outbreak hits? If today's conversation got you thinking, let's keep it going, share this episode with someone who should hear it, whether it's a fellow farmer, a food industry insider, or just a friend who's wondering why eggs are so expensive. And if you want to learn more about Barnwell Bio and their work, check out the links in the show notes. Thanks for listening to One Bite is Everything. If you haven't already, subscribe and leave a review. It helps more people like you find the show and be a part of these important conversations. I am your host, Dana DePrima. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and as always, keep asking those big questions.